2JZ versus RB26, which is better? We're gonna find out right after this message. I don't know if you know this, but I actually now have a merch store, and if you haven't checked out the video description below my videos, then you're missing out. Currently, I've got a pack full of movie quote t-shirts, and more styles are being added every month, and new items are in development right now. So have a look, see if there's anything you like, and wear it with pride. The link is in the video description below. You can't talk about the greatness of the JDM cars without talking about the engines that powered the best JDM sports cars over the last 3 decades. And there were lots of them. There have been many noteworthy engines over the years from Japanese companies, the F20C from the S2000s, the EJ257 from the Subarus, the K20s from Honda, 13Bs from the Mazdas, to name a few. But at the top of the list stand 2 bitter rivals. And these 2 Japanese engines stand above all the rest, the RB26 and the 2JZ GTE. So which one is better? The RB26 engine powers the R32, R33, and the R34 GTRs, as most of us already know. Many of us learn about the GTR in video games unless you were lucky enough to live in a country where the GTRs were being sold. That did not happen here in the United States, and now we have to wait 25 years to get these cars. And now they're starting to come in. The 1989 R32s are already here, R33s are already here, and R34s are coming up next year. The Mark IV Supra relies on the 2JZ, of course, an engine that has an established reputation of being almost bulletproof, up to and well beyond 1,000 horsepower without much effort, and these things have become favorites among drag racers. Some of these 2JZ cars are in the 6s. So the Mark IV Supra and the Skyline GTR are 2 of the most desirable cars produced over the last 40 years. Yes, I said 40 years. The first Supra actually appeared in 1979. I was just about to get my driver's license at that point. Now the Celicas had already been in the country since I think it was at 75, I want to say. And when the first Supra came out in 1979, it was actually called a Celica Supra. And the first Supra was powered by a single overhead cam. It was called a GA6 motor, 2.6 liters, inline 6, making about 123 horsepower. 0 to 60 flashed by in a leisurely 11.26 seconds. Today, Priuses are faster to 60. The quarter mile back then took a leisurely 18.4 seconds. God. That seems funny, but you have to remember that that same year, the V8 Z28 took 8.76 to hit 60 and 16.3 seconds to complete a quarter mile. So the Supra was respectful, but certainly not outstanding. I actually dated a girl in 1985 who owned a Mark I 1980 Supra. It was white with a tan interior. It was more of a grand touring car like the 300 ZXs were going, and it was basically a sporty cruiser, but not a sports car. But I did rack up a lot of miles in that car over in that summer, and I enjoyed the car, but it was not as nimble as my 240Z, but it did have air conditioning, so I got to drive that car a lot. That was our favorite car to drive for the summer. The 1982 Mark II Supra was a giant leap forward with the new 5MG engine. It was now a 2.8 liter engine, and this engine produced a maximum power of 145 horsepower at 5,600 RPMs and about 155 pound-feet of torque. This is the first one in the sale, but from 1983 to 1985, the power went up steadily and eventually hit 161 horsepower and 165 pound-feet of torque. And by 1985, 0 to 60 took only 8.4 seconds, and it was now running a 16.1 second quarter mile, making it faster than the V8 Z28 Camaro. American cars. But if you watch this great review by Everyday Driver, that he does a full test drive of the car, and it's a fantastic representation of what the car actually was back then and why it was important. When the A70 Supra, aka the Mark III Supra, was introduced, it had a 3-liter 6-cylinder engine. The turbocharged variant made 265 horsepower and about the same amount of torque, and so it was definitely a step up. I actually had the pleasure of driving one of these cars in 1989, and while I wanted one badly, I was still in school. I just didn't have the money to do it. But with the release of the Mark IV Supra as a 1993 and a half model year, Toyota introduced Americans to the 2JZ GTE engine, and everything changed. And the 2JZ would turn out to be a heavyweight, even literally. The 2JZ weighs in at 650 pounds with the turbos. It was almost 200 pounds heavier than the 7M GTE that it replaced, but it made 60 more horsepower, so it was a good deal, right? By comparison, the RB26 only weighs 420 pounds, 230 pounds less than the 2JZ. Big difference. Initially, the Mark IV Supra did not sell well. In 1998, only 1,232 Supras were sold nationwide. 1,232. The sales have been soft from the beginning, right from the beginning, and here's why. Back in 19 1994, a brand new Corvette retailed for about $36,180 something as MSRP. A brand new Mark IV Supra in 1994 retailed for $44,000 and some change. And of course, the people who could afford those prices were older. They were in their 40s and their 50s, and many of these guys were still wearing jean shirts with New Balance tennis shoes, a Corvette hat, and a Corvette shirt. They wanted V8 coupes, front engine, rear-wheel drive, manual transmission, and a ton of torque. But for those who dared to buy a Supra, they soon discovered that the 2JZ adapted very well to modifications, and before long, we were seeing 600 horsepower daily drivers, 800 horsepower street track cars, and by 1999, speed shops were regularly building 1,000 horsepower monsters. The average Supra on the road in Southern California, when it was modified, it was up over 600 horsepower. So everybody was doing it. And despite the fact that the RB26 had been around since 1989, it was not very common back then to see 1,000 horsepower GTRs on the streets of America at any point in history, even today, largely because we got these engines late and we didn't get the cars until they were 25 years old, because that was the importation law. These cars had to be 25 years old to come into the United States. But despite that, the Skyline GTRs found their way into the USA, a few at a time, often by illegal importers. But so why did tuners favor the 2JZ over the RB26 once the RB26s were in this country in great numbers? It's not just because the RB26 was rare. It came down to the reality of the true capabilities of the RB26 once you get past the hype. Part of this hype is the fact that the reputation of the RB26 benefited from being placed into an amazing platform. The all-wheel drive setup of the GTR deserves much of the credit for its successes in motorsports, not so much the engine. I mean, of course, it made a difference, but the chassis had an advantage over its competitors. So I think people who have never driven, owned, or built any of these cars may have been caught up in the hype for the platform and gave too much credit to the engine. And I'm not taking anything away from the RB26, but really, when you're racing four-wheel drive cars against two-wheel drive cars, what do you expect the outcome to be? And so much of the success in motorsports with the GTR was due to its chassis and its all-wheel drive configuration. This is at least partially responsible for the hype that has been heaped on the RB26 over the years, and it's become a legend. However, since the 2JZ was never used in professional road circuit racing, its reputation came solely from the drag racing and the high horsepower street cars. People and tuners were quick to discover the potential of 2JZ and found it to be highly capable and highly reliable, not to mention easier to tune. So it made it a favorite of tuners and fans. So what makes it easier to make big power with the 2JZ and more so than with the RB26? Well, there are a few things. Let's look at the specs. First off, the 2JZ is a larger displacement engine. It's 3 liters, while the RB26 is 2.6 liters. The compression ratio is 8.5 for both, and the 2JZ uses an 86 millimeter stroke. And generally speaking, what this means is that each time the spark plugs ignite the air-fuel mixture in each cylinder, more fuel is being burned, which means more energy is being produced for each combustion cycle, and that gives an engine with a larger displacement an advantage. The 2JZ also uses an iron block, which makes it strong. So does the RB26. The 2JZ is topped off with an aluminum cylinder head and dual overhead cams, just like the RB, so no first glance advantage one way or the other. But at 2.6 liters, the RB26 starts with a deficit because of its cylinders are smaller. The 73.7 millimeter stroke is a bit shorter than the 2JZs though, but that has some ramifications when we talk about the comparisons. Generally, for a given displacement, an engine with a tighter bore and a longer stroke will generate peak torque at a lower RPM than one with a bigger bore. So there's that. The RB26's rev limit is 8,000 RPMs. The 2JZ rev limit is about 6,800 RPMs for the non-VVTi engines up to 1995 and 7,200 RPMs for the VVTi variant starting in 1996. Each engine has their strengths. In terms of tuning potential, the stock 2JZ can hold up to 800 horsepower without any issues, even stretching it out to 1,000 horsepower. Won't do much damage to the stock engine block if with the proper tune. And beyond that, with today's higher resolution maps, we've seen cars go well beyond 1,500 horsepower with stock block 2JZs. Everybody's doing it. So by design, the 2JZ makes peak power and torque lower down in the rev range. The 2JZ also comes with forged pistons and forged connecting rods, which helps. The stock 2JZ also uses sequential turbochargers. So the small turbo comes on first to get you off the line and then spool up the other turbo. So throttle response is better versus an RB26 right out of the box. And of course, each engine has their weakness. With the 2JZ, the shim over bucket design is quite different from that of the RB26's shimless setup. This means that valve float in the 2JZ at high engine speed is pretty fairly common, and so that's one other thing that you have to take a look at when you're building a high performance 2JZ. The RB26 though is an interference engine, which means if a timing belt or the timing chain snaps, the valves can come in contact with the pistons, resulting in catastrophic engine damage and head damage. So that's a limiting factor as well. You have to be very cognizant of that. Also, the RB26 is over square, so it doesn't offer as much torque as the 2JZ, but the RB makes up for that by having a higher red line. And for people like to rev the out of their car, that's probably the best choice for them. Now, I've owned two Supras and one R34 GTR. I went into each purchase knowing the strengths and the weaknesses of both the engines and the powertrains of each of those cars. The RB26 can easily handle 400 horsepower, but anything approaching or past 600 horsepower, you're going to have to get inside the engine to upgrade a bunch of things, including pistons and the rods for sure, and many other things, oilings and all that kind of stuff. Because the RB26 suffers from poor oiling, particularly around the number 3 mains at high revs. It's a big problem if you're road racing often. Because of the intake design too, the number 6 cylinder gets way too much air and it runs lean, which means the number 6 cylinder is subject to spinning a bearing or breaking a piston because of pre-ignition, aka detonation. It's a big problem, and today's tuning devices are better than what they were 25 years ago, but the fact remains. The ceramic turbines in the turbos are a bit fragile and sensitive to detonation and are likely to implode at about 1.2 or 1.3 bar of boost. If you want more boost, you're going to have to upgrade the turbos. But of the two engines, only the RB26 has a true racing pedigree. And when I learned this, I was baffled. Toyota engineers never used the 2JZ for JTC and Group A racing since it was deemed heavy. Instead, Toyota opted to use the 3S GTE inline 4 and the 3UZ V8. However, the 2JZ drag race cars have been around the world since the 1990s and with great success. But RB26s were actually out before the 2JZ, so they were also prominent in drag racing overseas for far longer, given that they have been around longer, which makes sense. And so my personal experience with the two Supras that I've owned and the one R34 GTR that I own and the Paul Walker GTR that I had loaned to me for a summer afforded me a lot of opportunity to experience these engines in different variations in real-world daily driving. I love the quick spool of the stock 2JZ and the immense torque of my aftermarket twin HKS 2835 setup on the other Supra that I had. So basically, I experienced the stock setup with both of those cars, with the Supra and the Skyline, the basic performance upgrades, you know, more boost, injectors, downpipe, bigger injectors, and a new intercooler. Each of those cars drove well. They made about 400 horsepower in that configuration, which wasn't bad, and they drove pretty much as I expected. My next Supra had the big turbos and made 1,000 horsepower, and it never had a hiccup with that car. And again, both of the R34 GTRs I've driven had modest performance upgrades, mostly bolt-on, and in the case of my own GTR, a small turbo upgrade. And like I said, both were making about 400 horsepower, the one that I drive, the one that I own, and the one that I borrowed. But each car lived up to my expectations. They were fun, but there's one more thing. There's something about the sounds of each engine, and everybody has their favorite. I understand that. A built 2JZ with big turbos, the sound is amazing. But the sound of an RB30 with the big single is bordering on exotic. Yes. And of the two engines, it's hard to match the sexiness of the looks of an RB26. There's just something special about that engine. It just looks more exotic. It has fewer hoses, fewer pipes, and fewer wires. That may have something to do with it, but I personally think it looks better because for a long time, it was the forbidden fruit. We Americans had to wait 25 years to see these cars on our streets. And so a lot of people have never seen an RB26 in person until the last, I would say, 5 or 10 years. So it just makes it more desirable, right? So let's talk about extreme cases of each of these engines. Which one has made the highest horsepower in any racing applications? Well, how about a 2,600 horsepower 2JZ powered 240SX at 11,000 RPMs making 95 pounds of boost? The June R32 GTR made 2,500 horsepower at 85 pounds of boost. That'll wake you up. So what do you think? Which is your favorite? Tell me in the comments and tell me why. That's it for this week, everybody. I'll see you next time.